Welcome to this event organized by Caucasus Studies and RUCAR. And I'm Karina Wamling. I'm one of the co-directors of RUCAR.
Great. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to take part in the 20th anniversary of the Georgian course. I'm one of the graduates of that course from a long time ago, and as you will hear, this played a very important part in my time in Georgia. So I'm going to share my screen now, which I hope will mean that I disappear and you. Right. I hope everyone can see the slides. They're not quite, the layout on the screen is not quite perfect for some reason, but I hope they're legible.
It's fine. Yeah.
I'm going to start with a picture that for me sums up the intensity of what the experience of being ambassador in Georgia in those days was. What the picture shows is me in the blue jacket with my colleague, the French ambassador, Eric Fournier, at Black Cliff Lake in Lagodeki on the border with Russia. And in fact, the hills you can see in the background in that picture are in Russia, in Dagestan, I think.
The reason that sorry to interrupt you, Dennis. Could you take that slide, because we just see the first slide now.
You can.
We see only the first slide.
Right. Is it still the first slide?
It's just the first slide, so perhaps you should have the thumbnails too.
Can you see it now?
No.
No. Right. I'm very sorry.
Yeah. Now you're there. Now we see it.
Right. And is it large enough to be visible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. As I say, this for me is a very significant photograph because it brings together a number of things that are really important. Obviously, we're in the mountains in a very beautiful part of Georgia. I'm there because I wanted to be there to experience the place, but also with my colleague to promote an EU environmental program at the time. So I'm working against the background of Russia, which was there all the time. And also on a personal note, I'm in Lagodeki, which became for me one of my favorite places in Georgia for reasons that I'll come back to as we go along. So there you are. It brings things together: diplomacy, mountains, Lagodeki, Russia, and colleagues. Working with colleagues, Georgian and from other countries, was a central part of the experience. And it goes on. I mean, for example, the current Georgian ambassador in London, Sophie Katsarova, was actually a colleague of mine at the embassy when I was there. But that's background and to give you an idea of the intensity of the experience for me. But what I'm actually going to talk about is these elements about how I came to learn Georgian and what that meant, what living in Georgia was about, and then about some of the key things that we were involved with: democracy, the story of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the story of Georgia and Russia, and just to finish, some things about other ways in which we engaged with Georgia. So this takes us back to the beginning of 2006 when I was working in London on China, and I was told that the Foreign Office wanted to appoint me ambassador to Uzbekistan, and that I would need to learn Russian to do that. So I started trying to find out more about Uzbekistan, preparing the family, arranging to move, and planning to start learning Russian. I did ask some questions. Why am I learning Russian, not Uzbek? And I was told that that was our policy for all parts of the former Soviet Union, so that people could be, once they served in one country, could deployed in another. But I wasn't entirely convinced, and I was still thinking about it when I got another phone call, which was to tell me that there had been some complicated staffing decision, and I wasn't going to Uzbekistan anymore. I was going to go to Georgia, and was that all right? I knew just about enough about Georgia to say, of course, that's all right. And I asked again, what language am I going to be learning? And they said, you're going to be learning Russian. There didn't seem to be any way to get them off that, but I decided that I wanted to find out if it was actually possible to learn Georgian on my own. So I started researching on the internet and discovered that there wasn't very much in the way of possibilities, but what there was a course at Malmö University. So I applied for it, not quite knowing what this would get me into. I had to prove, I had to apply as an undergraduate through the normal Swedish undergraduate system, and I had to prove that I had completed a secondary education and that I could speak English. The first one was straightforward. I dug out my old school certificates and I sent them off. The second one looked like being a problem because I've never taken an exam in my life to show that I can speak English. So I had some negotiation by email with the people running the process. And they eventually accepted that my Cambridge MA certificate would prove that I could speak and write English. So I started the course in the autumn of 2007. And at the time I was commuting into London to work, to work and then for my Russian lessons. So I started taking Aronson's Georgian introduction to Georgian on the train with me and listening to the recordings that someone had kindly made available on the internet of the exercises. And I found this worked. I found the Malmö course was very clear, very well structured, and did actually introduce me to the basics. Meanwhile, I started Russian and started Russian in November 2007. And a few months later, I was sent to St. Petersburg for immersion training to live with a Russian family. That coincided with the exam for the Malmö course. So I had to work at my Georgian in St. Petersburg in an internet cafe on Nevsky Prospect because we didn't have Wi-Fi in the house, and do my exam as well from Russia. It all worked. And when I got back from Russia at the end of May in 2007, I had also passed the Russian exam I needed to pass. And so I tried again with the Foreign Office. I said to them, look, you've spent the money to train me in Russian to the standard you want, but actually I've got another 6 weeks before I go to Georgia. You must have saved some money, so why don't you let me spend that on some more Georgian lessons? And this time they gave in, and they said you can have a month of Georgian lessons from a teacher we'll find in London, but you won't get far enough to be able to use it. It's too difficult. Well, I found a teacher, also called Manana, and with her, I set out to do something that my wife had suggested. And this was that instead of simply continuing a program of learning Georgian and Georgian grammar in particular, I should create 20 or so little cards on which I'd got 2 or 3 sentences of the kind that an ambassador might need in their first few days in a post. and work with the teacher on those, learn how to say them, learn the key things I needed to make an initial impression on people. And this turned out to be a brilliant idea. It's exactly what I did. And almost immediately on arriving in Tbilisi, I found myself at an event where a journalist spotted who I was. It was a cultural event, I think possibly in Bakke Park. I can't quite remember where it was. But the journalist came up to me and said, "I think you're the new ambassador. Would you like to say something for our television channel?" And I used 2 or 3 of my cards and said something in Georgian. I'm not sure that they quite believed that's what I was doing, because I think they did, when they showed the clip, they did actually dub someone over me speaking in Georgian. But I'd achieved something that I wasn't sure I could, which was to make my introduction to Georgia in Georgian. A few days later, I presented my credentials to the president, then Saakashvili, and again I did it in Georgian using my cards. The reaction I got was enormous. Within a few, people would stop me in the streets that summer and speak to me in Georgian and thank me for speaking Georgian. They would even give me their babies and ask to be photographed with me. This, of course, is wonderful for an ambassador in terms of getting known. It also, however, landed me with a big problem, and that was that I really did need to learn Georgian well enough to be able to operate in public, not just on safe occasions when I could use my cards. So I had to find another teacher, and I did in Nana Shaftal, I'd say. This is a photograph. I hope you can see this slide now. This is a photograph in my residence in Georgia when Manana Kobaidze and Karina Vamling came to Georgia, and we all had lunch together. And this again is a really important photograph for me because what I learned of Georgian from Nana and Manana was the absolute foundation of everything that I did in Georgia in the three years I was there. So in this semi-public forum, I want to say thank you very much indeed to both of you for what you did and for making everything possible. Now, what was this all about? It is, of course, enormous fun to learn Georgian. Absolutely fascinating language and the way it works, and the different ways of looking at things that it brings to you, and great fun for an ambassador to quickly become a public figure. But there is, of course, a deeper reason behind all this, and I was in Georgia with a very clear mission as the British ambassador. I was to support conflict resolution. I was to support Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration, and I was to support Georgia's democracy. And what I needed to do was create the space for myself to do that, create a voice that I could use that people would listen to, and create the connections with people that made working on these things possible. So how did this work out? First of all, a lot of the connection that you make as an ambassador and the ability to get people to talk to you and to listen to you and to allow you to influence their thinking is simply about being in the country, living there, engaging with it, and being seen as someone who does understand and does want to understand. So I tried to be as active as possible. I tried to be as visible as possible, and I tried to do things that deepened my understanding of the country, and do those things in ways that were authentic. You can, of course, learn to be interested in anything, and if it really matters, you can make yourself visibly interested in things in a way, and have an impact that way. But in the end, the most valuable things are the ones that are authentic, that flow from your own personality and interests. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we found to engage with Georgian culture. Firstly, there was getting to know the country and its culture. There's another photograph of me with the French ambassador and some Georgian park rangers in Lagodehi on our way up to the Black Cliff Lake. This is obviously one of the reasons for my interest in Lagodehi is simply how beautiful it is. And as I've mentioned, another one is because it is on the border with Russia. But there is a third one that I'm going to come back to the next time I mention Lagodehi. We traveled all over the country. This is a photograph of a dance using, you can just see in the background the water jugs, a dance in Dusheti. It was, you see a lot of wonderful dancing in Georgian. This one was really unusual and struck us because of the way the dance had obviously been made out of the process of fetching water. So one of the things we did was travel a lot and engage with as many things like dance as we could wherever we were in the country. I've just realized that I've been saying we a lot. And I need to emphasize again the role that my wife, Kate Keefe, played. Because throughout our time as diplomats, we have always tried to do things together as a couple, because it magnifies the connections we can make and makes it more fun. It's easier in some countries than others. It was very easy and very welcome in Georgia when we appeared together. It was harder, for example, in Russia, and it's deep cultural reasons why. But Kate, if anything, became more involved in the cultural side than I did, and in particular in music and language. She helped Nana Shaftoladze with the editing of a Georgian English phrase book. Hope you remember that, Nana. And she helped a Georgian choir with translations of recordings they made. Because among all the cultural things that there are to engage with in Georgia, and we enjoyed everything from the wonderful ballet to local events. Music was an absolutely key way that we engaged. We joined for a while a choir, Okrostumrebi, which was a mixed choir of Georgians and foreigners, but that sang in the Georgian polyphonic style, which for us was really interesting because it is so different from the church music we'd been used to singing in Britain. The previous 5 years before we left to Georgia, we'd been singing in a choir which sang regularly in the old cathedrals in England, where there is a very beautiful, very complex tradition of singing that's at a very high standard, but also with all sorts of cultural practices involved in it that you need to learn, and you need to learn to behave in a very, very specific way. Later in Georgia and in Russia and Serbia, we also sang with Orthodox church choirs, and learned again there the very different approach to liturgy, one that's rather more improvisatory, that has a flow of a different kind. But we had the chance to bring two of these traditions together, and this is what this photograph shows. Is an English Church of England bishop in the red and black, and the Archbishop of the Georgian Evangelical Baptist Church, with a choir behind made up of my wife and me and a Georgian choir, and in the front, in the purple and white, is the papal nuncio. And what we are doing is we are celebrating the English tradition of evensong, and those of you who have never had the chance to experience it, if you are in England and you are in a city with a cathedral, go and hear evensong. It is a very, very beautiful and distinctive form of music. But engaging with a Georgian choir who are of a very high standard, while teaching them how to perform in the style that English evensong requires, was another very intense experience. But I put the photograph here because I think the photograph is fun with all the senior clerics in their robes. But the wider point is that because music was something that we were really interested in and interested in performing, it opened up avenues across society that we might not have opened by other routes. We would probably have opened up other avenues with different people. Every ambassador is different. But this is an example to me of how you use your personality to do the job of being ambassador. I'll mention a couple of other things that we became involved in. I studied classical philology at Cambridge and did research on Hellenistic Greek poetry at Oxford. So I bring with me an interest in the ancient world, and through people we knew from our university days, we got in contact with the archaeologists who were working at Nokala Kevi, and discovered the wonderful world of Georgian archaeology. We visited many other places, Pichvnari, Vani, Dmanisi, particularly places where British and Georgian archaeologists were working together. One spin-off of this actually was that one of our daughters eventually studied archaeology and did spend one summer working at Nokala Kevi. She even learnt some Georgian in the process. And there, just to remind us about Georgian hospitality, because I haven't mentioned it so far, here is us at Dmanisi, enjoying one of the great traditions of Georgia. Now, these are just examples of the many ways in which it's possible to engage. And as I say, all of them are valuable in their own right, but also for an ambassador, help to give you the platform that makes it possible to carry out what are sometimes quite difficult work and difficult conversations. And I'm going to move now to the first area, which is democracy in Georgia. We were in Georgia, many of you will recall, at a very turbulent time politically, leaving aside the war in 2008. There had been a great deal of turbulence in Georgian politics in the second half of 2007, leading to elections at the beginning of 2008. Now, I have worked in other countries on democratization, and I know from experience in those countries that only the people of a country themselves can decide how they want their country to develop. But an ambassador is able to help the process. First of all, by being an advocate, but by being a representative of the international community, and by talking about international standards, by talking about the OSCE and the Council of Europe, and other bodies that work to support countries. And also, an ambassador can have a role in talking with and getting to know all the political players in a country. And that was one of the most fascinating parts of the job. I set out to get to know both those in government and opposition leaders in politics, and to understand their perspectives on things. And of course, those perspectives varied very widely. Georgian politics is always a fairly high energy business. People speak and act passionately because that is the style that the voters, I think, expect. So these conversations with people were often quite tough. We're often I would often be hearing very passionate, very strongly argued points, and be wanting to return the conversation to the fundamentals that everyone shared an interest in making this process of democracy work. And I was a little while ago when Salome Zurabishvili was appointed president of Georgia, I was reminded of this very strongly, because she is one of the people with whom I remember having some of the most passionate and strongly argued conversations in those days when she was a leader in the opposition. I also knew from my work in other countries that one of the most useful things that an ambassador and his diplomats can do is to observe elections. And this is for several reasons. One is obviously that observing elections helps the process locally. Knowing that elections are observed gives confidence to the participants in an election, whether voters or officials or politicians, that the process is being conducted fairly. If people have doubts about that, if that perception is undermined, then of course there are all sorts of difficult political consequences. So the first reason is observing elections is a good thing, because observing elections as such contributes to democracy. But observing elections also does something else. It gives you a very intimate insight into the way in which society works, the way in which politics works, and the way in which individual places work. And this is in 2000. So I was determined in 2008 that as many as possible of my people at the embassy would get out and observe elections, and that I would go somewhere I didn't know, as far away from Tbilisi as possible, and observe the elections there. We didn't do this on our own. We did this with the American and other embassies, and we coordinated with the OSCE observers, so that we built up among us the maximum understanding and factual observation that we could. And that was both to understand it, but also to give us credibility. If you are going after an election to talk to the government or to opposition politicians, if you're going to talk to the winners or to talk to the losers, if you're going to talk to the people running the elections, and you have tough messages to give, if you want to say, look, this was unsatisfactory here, or the way you do this is not contributing to confidence in democracy, then it makes an enormous difference to be able to say, I and my people were out there, and this is what we saw happening. And I didn't see this particular thing which my people have reported, but from what I know of your election system, I believe it. This is something you need to take seriously. For my own part, I went to Lagodechi, and this was the start of Lagodechi's importance for me. It was, as people will remember, a very cold period, deep snow. This is my car, not in Lagodechi, but in, and I have forgotten exactly where, somewhere in the east of Georgia, where we stopped off to see election preparations. But in Lagodechi itself, I decided that since I was new to Georgia, I would see the whole day through. I would start in the early hours of the morning when the officials arrived with the election materials. I would watch the whole process, watch the voting, watch the counting, watch the sending of the results into the next stage in the process. It was a very long, very cold night, because we were in a school which did not have functioning heating and didn't have very good light. Half of our work was by candlelight. But what I saw was something enormously encouraging. I saw the care and commitment with which almost everyone involved, whether they were electoral officials or local party officials, and of course the voters, devoted to this process. I also got a strong feeling of the way in which local society worked. If you spend 24 hours in the same room with people focused on the same task, conversations develop. You talk about all sorts of things as they go through what after all is can be a very boring and time-taking process. And so I got an insight into the local dynamics. Who in the town mattered, who dealt with whom, how problems were solved, who had authority, who had wisdom. I'm sure, of course, there would be so much more to learn with even a little bit more time. But in that intense experience of an election, and an election that was very important, I felt that I'd learnt things that I couldn't learn by any other means. And I went observing in every other election thereafter. This is the parliamentary elections in May 2008. That's my wife on the right and my middle son, Daniel, on the left. Both, as you can see from their badges, accredited as observers. And I think I took the photograph, which is why I'm not in it, and contributing both to this process of understanding the elections so that we could talk about them with confidence and credibility, and contributing to our understanding of how things worked. There were many things to recall from that election, but just two snapshots. One was that we met a group of I've now forgotten the correct word. Migrant shepherds, people who brought their sheep up and down from different pastures according to the season, who had come down, in fact, from inside South Ossetia to vote. And the other was visiting a military base where the commander had unfortunately slightly got hold of the wrong idea about an election, and he had decided that he wanted to be the base. I think he had a couple of hundred soldiers that completed voting in the fastest time possible. So he sat at a table with a ballot box in front of him, and his men lined up in a long line in front of them, and each of them dashed forward, ticked a box and ticked a ballot and put it in the box. I tried to talk to him about secrecy, and about allowing people to take their time and not to be influenced and so on. But I'm afraid that was one of my less less successful conversations. But it shows how people who think they have the best of motives can end up doing something that isn't desirable. Now, that was something affecting directly the whole of the country and enabling us to get to know the whole of Georgia. But a large part of my work was connected with conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and focused on Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And I decided when I arrived that at the embassy we didn't know as much about these issues as we should, and that we should become more active and engaged on them, more active and engaged with the Georgian government and with the Georgian society, but also specifically by seeing if we could understand more what was happening in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which even in those days were pretty difficult to access, particularly from Georgia. We focused on three things. We focused on trying to encourage the different kinds of dialogue between the de facto authorities and the Georgian government, because there were channels of different kinds and different levels aimed at, many of them at dealing with practical problems, which we'll come on to, but also exploring whether there were any ways of approaching the political issues. Very, very difficult, and of course, all now made immeasurably more difficult by the war. The second thing was that there were international presences in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, UNAMIG in Abkhazia and the OSCE in South Ossetia. And in particular in UNAMIG in Abkhazia, there were British officers who, it was part of my duty anyway to keep in touch with them from the point of view of their welfare. But they provided, obviously, a way of making contact. And thirdly, I wanted to understand, and if possible, to influence the situation of people actually living there. There were very difficult issues, both political and security issues, but simply issues of human welfare, of poverty, of migration, refugees in all parts of the country. So the obvious way to do this, it seemed to me, was to actually visit these places, which at the time diplomats were not doing very often. And this became very interesting. First of all, the attitude of the Georgian government was very interesting. On the one hand, they were quite uncomfortable with the idea that I might do something that somehow indicated recognition of the de facto authorities. So they, for understandable reasons, they had quite a lot of skepticism about contacts of any kind with officials. At the same time, they were also very eager for anything that shed more light on the situation in these places. So quite often, when I went to either Abkhazia or South Ossetia, and I'll come on to how I did that, I would get, first of all, a conversation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, either in person or by the telephone, saying, we understand you're going, we don't think this is a good idea, what do you think you're going to achieve? All legitimate challenges to what I was doing. And then a later conversation asking me, what did they say? What's happening? What do they think about this? Did you see any Russians? So an understandable ambiguity, which over time resolved as I came to understand the best way to explain to the Georgian authorities what I was doing, and also as they learned that I could contribute insight to the problem. So what did it involve? Well, getting to Abkhazia changed all the time. It started out with a rather quite well-oiled process run by the UN. We would fly to Senaki. This is Senaki airfield in an aeroplane. We transfer to a helicopter, and the helicopter would fly out across the Black Sea and into Sukhumi. Later on, that changed. We had to fly down to Batumi and up by helicopter, and then the helicopter became unavailable and we had to drive, and it is a very, very long drive. However, it did mean that driving on those later trips, I got to see more of Abkhazia, and in particular of Gali, which I will come back to. So here is me. Here is Sukhumi. I think that's the Ritza Hotel taken from the pier. We used to stay in the hotel, and we would have meetings with the de facto officials, with NGOs, with the UN, and I would always try and organize to visit somewhere outside Sukhumi, Gagra, Lake Ritza, anything to give me better understanding of the situation. And the situation in parts was grim. This is Gali. Much of Abkhazia was running perfectly well, although there were still signs of the fighting. But in Gali, the situation was desperate. Many people farming at a very low level, difficulties of communication, signs of war damage. We tried through our support for the UN and NGOs to help the situation, but it remained a fundamentally difficult one, as illustrated by this. That in those days, the main bridge over the Inguri River was functioning. Very complicated regulations and procedures. It could, as a diplomat, if you had made the right arrangements, it didn't take that long, but it was still complicated, and you never knew whether it was going to work. For ordinary people, it was, of course, enormously difficult. There were other ways of crossing the river, and this photograph shows you a bridge at Tageloni, the kind of crossing that people had to make to carry on their daily lives. But we would have those talks, and up until the war, I visited, I think, about every 6 weeks or so, and I was trying to bring other members of the embassy into that and to develop a regular pattern of visiting. After the war, it became very much more difficult, and the de facto authorities said they wouldn't talk to ambassadors from Tbilisi. I managed to persuade them a couple of times that they needed to talk to me, and I did. But it eventually became too complicated and impossible, which obviously I regretted very much. I had actually started to learn to speak a little Abkhaz, but the war meant that investment wasn't useful. The picture was much the same with South Ossetia, obviously much smaller, less developed, much weaker de facto institutions. And I visited a few times with the OSCE, again, to try and encourage talks, to support the OSCE's work in there to improve conditions. And this is a very interesting example. We're standing on a river which has some complicated waterworks, and it's an irrigation system that, in principle, benefits everybody. But is it because of the political situation was more or less not functioning, and there were incredibly complicated and detailed studies and talks going on to try and make the system work better. And I was visiting to support that. And we also visited to support other projects. This is a little school in a Georgian village that we visited. That is actually a shipping container that we're inside. That's my wife again, and the teacher with plywood walls inside. As you can see from her smile, a lovely teacher with who was doing really good work with the small children that she had, but in very difficult circumstances. The last visit I made to South Ossetia was on the 6th of August 2008. It was clear at that point that we were very near the beginning of a conflict. We were trying to support getting a channel open between the Georgian authorities and the de facto authorities, and I went to Skin Valley to try and persuade them to talk, specifically to try and persuade them to talk to Temur Yakubashvili, and I talked to the Russians as well, but it was fruitless. I mean, they listened politely, but I didn't get anywhere. And it was also one of the spookiest days of my life, because everywhere was absolutely deserted, and there was the atmosphere of a thunderstorm about to break, which it did. And I want to say that there is so much that can be said about the war and what happened, how it started. There is, for those who are interested, a really first-rate report written by the Swiss diplomat Heidi Tagliavini about the outbreak of the war and what happened. But I want to make 2 points. One, and this is where we come to Russia. One is that whatever your view of how the fighting started, once it did, Russia used the opportunity to take over Abkhazia and South Ossetia and establish a strategic position inside Georgia by pushing out territory, particularly of South Ossetia, that makes new progress very difficult indeed. But it raises the question why Russia had a plan to do that and wanted to do that, and why Russia sees hard power in the end as the right way of dealing with its neighbors, and in particular with those neighbors that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. Because if you stand back and think about it, about the history, about the strength, about the nature of Russian culture, its depth and extent, if you think about the economics of it, the scale of Russia's economy, it's not in the top world league, but it is a very significant regional economy based on energy. Surely, soft power and simply becoming a pole of attraction for Russia's neighbors would be the right way to behave. But because of Russia's domestic politics, because of the need for there to be a strong leader who demonstrates their strength, Russia pushes itself into this hard power approach. And the interesting thing is that in many ways, many thoughtful people in Russia are aware of this problem. And I found it in so many conversations that I had after I left Tbilisi and moved to Moscow as deputy to the ambassador there. I should explain that the UK has a system in which being an ambassador is a job, not a rank. So you can go from being ambassador in a small country to being minister, as we call it, in a big embassy. as part of the development of your career, which is what I did. And it turned out that in the end, the Foreign Office's bet on me learning Russian came off, I suppose. And when I got to Russia, particularly in the first year or so, I had so many conversations which started with, you were there during the war. What's it like? What is Saakashvili like? What is going on? Why does Georgia behave the way it does? Why did they start a war with us? This is their view of it. But at some point, almost without them noticing, they would start to talk about the old days in the Soviet Union, when they could travel to Georgia, when they could go to the resorts in Abkhazia, when they could enjoy the food, when people brought tomatoes up from Georgia on the aeroplanes because the tickets were so cheap. And then they would start to talk about the Russian literary view of the Caucasus. They talk about Lermontov and Pushkin and Shamil. And at this point in the conversation, I would say, and of course, Griboyedov is buried in Tbilisi. And on some occasions, people would even become tearful as we talked about how dreadfully everything had gone wrong. So there is this ambivalence, which is created, I think, by the nature of Russian politics. And it makes it very difficult for a country such as Georgia to manage its relationship with its big neighbor. That's a picture of the war. This is Russian troops leaving, actually, Gori. And that's a crossing point into South Ossetia. But the pictures I want to leave you with, and I'm going on slightly longer than I should do. So I'm going to go quickly through the last phase about other things we did during that time to develop connections with Georgia. We had visits. That's David Cameron, who visited just a week after the war when he was leader of the opposition. Behind his right shoulder, you can see a woman with long hair and then another man. And that man is Ed Llewellyn, who subsequently became our ambassador to Paris. This is me with Halo Trust, blowing up some unexploded ordnance left over after the war. There was huge quantities that had to be destroyed, particularly around South Ossetia. And this is my wife laying a poppy at what we had discovered was the site of the British War Cemetery in Batumi. While I was in Tbilisi, we were able to get some work done on what remains of the British War Cemetery in Tbilisi. But the one in Batumi that the embassy had lost knowledge of, we were able to discover it, and there is now a proper monument and proper care taken. These are the graves of British soldiers and nurses who died during the British military presence in Georgia at the end of the First World War. Just to give you a flavor of the variety of connections there are, and I haven't, of course, talked about the wonderful literary collections or the war drops another time maybe. But I want to leave you with a few images. That's another Supra at Nokalakavi with David Lomatashvili and David Colvin, the two scholars who started British cooperation there. And this is the view from my window when I was ambassador. You may have seen this photograph too, because the embassy use it from time to time on social media materials. But I looked out of my window one day and there was St. George with a rainbow behind him. So I took that photograph to remind me of just how wonderful it was to be ambassador in Georgia. And then I will leave you with one final photograph, which of something that no one who has seen it will ever forget. Thank you very much.